Thank you.
Dr. Boaz, by the way, the most important thing she wants me to say by way of introduction is if this lecture intrigues you, take classes with Dr. Boaz. In fact, she's another one of my very favorite faculty on campus and another faculty member that I know that changes lives. Okay? So, Dr. Boaz, PhD is from UC Davis. She was previously a faculty member at SUNY Rockford. She has done work all over the world, particularly in the area of nonviolent political resistance, nonviolent political revolution action. She's also, and please take note of this, it's one of the most exciting things on campus. She is the faculty advisor for our Model UN program, which each year brings how many students?
Well, this year it's 32.
32 students to New York, right?
Yep.
Or participate in actual UN activities.
The largest Model UN simulation in the world, and we get to visit the UN. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's one of the coolest things that I know about on campus. Please give a warm FYE welcome to Dr. Cynthia Boaz.
All right, thank you. I know that earlier applause was for the fact that this is the last lecture of the semester. It wasn't for me, but I'm still going to take it. So this seems like really loud. Is this too loud? Okay. Okay. Is that okay? All right. Yeah, that just was too close to my face. So firstly, I want to acknowledge how grateful I am to be back with FYE. I taught in the program for 4 years. I'm sad that I couldn't do it again this year. And I'm sure that you guys in the program know this, but I just want to reinforce that you're really fortunate not only to be in FYE at Sonoma State, but to be with the faculty that you're with. These are some of the best faculty that Sonoma State has to offer, and I know you're in your freshman year, so you don't have a lot of frame of reference, but take my word for it when I say that you're very, very fortunate to start your college experience with these folks. So if you know, I actually think we should give them a round of applause before the end of the semester. I mean, you guys have no idea how hard this faculty works for you. Or maybe you do. But if you don't, now you do. All right, so I've got to cram a lot of information into a short period of time, and I might be speaking kind of quickly, so bear with me. It was hard to find things to cut out of this lecture, given the relevance of this topic for this political moment that we're living. So we're going to start today with the assumption that American democracy, the American democratic experiment, is in danger. But with the caveat that it's not dead yet. And so that's what we're going to focus on for today. Some of the evidence for the assertion that American democracy is in danger would include things like low voter turnout. The United States has some of the lowest voter turnout in the entire world, even at the level of the presidency, which typically draws 2 or 3 times as much turnout as any other election. In a good year, we have 50% voter turnout. Compare that to other industrialized democratic societies where you see turnout between 75 and 85%. We also have relatively low levels of what we call civic literacy, knowledge about how politics works. Most Americans can't even name their 2 senators or their member of the House of Representatives. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot now, but think about that. Think if you can name your senators and your congressperson, and if you can't, that might be some information that you want to store away. Media consolidation, the concentration of media ownership into smaller and smaller hands, which means that we get less diversification of information and we get more questionable information and news. I'm not talking about fake news like the way that Donald Trump talks about it. I'm talking about news that serves the interests of a small political or economic elite. Because when media is a business, then the profit motive competes with the quality of information. Many people are still living without access to health insurance, health care, and that number is going to go up dramatically over the next 10 years. There are increasing numbers of hate crimes and discrimination. We now have, it looks like, a legitimate white nationalist, white supremacist movement in the United States that's out in the open in a way that we haven't seen for a very, very long time. And we're seeing the consolidation of political power in the hands of a smaller and smaller elite. And many other things, but I don't want to take up more time. Although, if this is of interest to you, I do teach a class called Issues in Modern American Politics, as a little plug. So I'm not going to talk about the legal definition of citizenship today, which is the status of a person recognized under the custom or law as being a legal member of a sovereign state. Instead, I'm going to focus on the more complex, and I'd argue more important definition of democratic citizenship that is defined by the decisions that you make and your relationship to the larger society. There are different terms for what I'm calling citizenship here, and I'm kind of going to use a lot of terms sort of interchangeably. But some of those terms would be civic engagement, political activism, and public participation. But to be even more specific, I'm going to focus on one aspect of engaged citizenship, which is what we call civil resistance. That takes the form of mass, nonviolent action by the people that causes a disruption to such a degree that it can bring about social or political change. I asked your faculty members to have you read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail for today, because I think that that is the best treatise on the kind of democratic citizenship that I'm talking about today. And I see some of you guys looking at each other like, what? So if you haven't read Letter from Birmingham Jail yet, please do. If not for me, for your own edification. It's probably one of the best pieces of political writing in existence. In fact, many initiatives just over the last year under this current president, including the DACA repeal, the first 2 Muslim bans, and various other assaults on rights of underrepresented groups, were stopped because of people, because of the kinds of actions that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to make an argument in 3 parts. If you aren't willing to be a democratic citizen, you don't deserve to be a citizen of a democratic society. So the idea here is that democracy is not free. Democracy is not without responsibilities. It's almost a relational kind of concept. Therefore, if democracy fails, it's our responsibility, because democracy depends on the people. It depends on the people holding up their citizenship responsibilities. And this is because no ruler or system can oppress or even stay in power without the consent of the people. Now, what does that mean? Think about it this way. If everyone withdrew their consent, if everyone stopped obeying, just going along with what they're told to do without thinking, then government couldn't do anything. So as a thought exercise, let's use an extreme historical example. Imagine what would have happened if the Jews and the Germans who had sympathized with them had resisted Nazi orders in the 1930s. Let's imagine that, conservatively speaking, about 50% of people living in Germany in the 1930s would not have approved of the genocide of millions had they been asked prior to the start of the Holocaust what they thought of the idea. Hopefully it's more than 50%, but let's just, to be conservative, let's say 50. Would the Holocaust have been possible if half of the population just refused to go along, just refused to carry out orders? Surely the Nazis could or would not have jailed or killed half of their population. The loss of resources would have been devastating, unsustainable. And at some point, those members of the security forces who were tasked with carrying out the orders against their own family members would have started to refuse. The Holocaust worked because the Nazi Party was able, over time, to dehumanize Jews and other groups in the eyes of the larger population, to make them the other. But if the citizens of Germany had refused to buy into that perception, or had shown up in massive numbers themselves to have yellow stars sewn on their clothing when the Jews began to be registered, the subsequent stages of genocide would not have followed. So in civil resistance, numbers matter. Everybody's participation, or in this case, might be withdrawal of consent or withdrawal of participation, matters. I want to just give you a little bit of contemporary context that actually also links back to the civil rights movement. You're looking at, the picture on the top is, I obviously recognize Martin Luther King Jr. Sitting next to him is a man named Reverend James Lawson. Lawson was the leading theoretician and tactician of the civil rights movement. If you saw the movie The Butler, he was portrayed by Jesse Williams in that movie. He was asked by King to come to Nashville to lead the campaign to desegregate the city. And then he went on to subsequent campaigns throughout the civil rights movement and became the key strategist, became the strategic voice of the movement. Well, he's 89 years old today, and he's still doing this work. And in fact, back in October, he convened an institute at which he invited about 40 of the country's top organizers working in various areas of social justice in order to teach them about Kingian strategies of nonviolent resistance. And I was asked to be an instructor at that institute, and it was an incredibly humbling and inspirational experience. And during his opening speech, Lawson spoke about the current moment we're living in and this particular idea of citizenship. And this is what he said. He said, "We need civil resistance as never before in human history." This is, by the way, someone who lived through the brutalities of the civil rights era, of segregation, of Jim Crow, and so on. If it doesn't happen, the fate of the human race is tenuous. It is the singular most significant hope and possibility for humanity. Now, in order to get at the idea of citizenship, I want to clarify some other terminology. So we hear, right now, in this moment, we're hearing a lot of language about what it means to be American, or what our job as Americans are in the world, right? So there's the idea of make America great again, or America first. And these ideas are allegedly ideas related to this concept called patriotism. But I would argue that actually they're expressions of something called nationalism, and I just want to make a distinction between these two concepts. They're similar, but it's critical to understand the difference between the two. And a very shorthand way of thinking about this is that nationalism is loyalty to, like, your tribal group. So it's loyalty maybe to an ethnicity, possibly religion. Patriotism is loyalty to the principles of the democratic government that we allegedly live in. So a nationalist, a person who's expressing nationalist ideas, often will bring out, intentionally or unintentionally, the worst in us. What Abraham Lincoln might have called the darker angels of our natures. But then they tell us that we're the best. So there's this interesting contradiction. A nationalist, according to George Orwell, endlessly broods on power, victory, defeat, and reverence, but tends to be uninterested in what happens in the real world. A patriot, as I'm defining it, by contrast, wants their nation to live up to its proclaimed ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves, to draw on what Lincoln called the better angels of our natures. A patriot has universal values, standards by which she judges her country, always wishing it well and always wishing it would do better. The term democracy, which we throw around a lot, literally comes from two Greek words, a combination of two Greek words pushed together. Demos, which means the people, and kratia, which means power or rule. So the term democracy literally means rule by the people. So what is it exactly? What does that mean? Well, it's a type of political system in which people are ultimately accountable. And by the way, a republic, I know that some of us, like on social media or wherever, you get these arguments about the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic. That is a complete misunderstanding of both of those concepts, because a republic is a form of a democratic system. A republic is a form of democracy. They're not mutually exclusive concepts. They're on different spectrums. So if someone's using that argument willfully, they should know better, because it's not a legitimate argument. In any case, democracy is a system in which people govern themselves directly or indirectly. In order to understand citizenship as civic behavior, we have to first understand this concept of democracy. And so democracy requires a few features, some of which might be surprising to you. So we know that democracy is government of, for, and by the people. Each of those has a distinct meaning, and each is important. Government of the people means that it's made up, the representatives are made up from the general population. They're us. They're not some special elite aristocratic class that has some divine right to rule. Government for the people gets at the idea of general will or the greater good, taking care of the interests of everyone. And by the people, which is the one that's most overlooked, but maybe even the most important, is the idea that democracy comes from the will of the people itself. It's a bottom-up organic process. Democracy is an agreement between people and government. So the idea of, say, imposing democracy in another part of the world or transporting democracy somewhere else, those are oxymoronic. You can't do that by definition. Those democracies will inevitably fail. Democracy also requires conflict and disagreement in order to animate it and give it life. So you should be very suspicious of anyone who tries to say that conflict is bad for democracy. It's not and the reason is because we all have different interests, right? We're all different people. So it would be very weird and creepy if everybody believed the same thing all the time, right? So the idea in democracy is to figure out how to mediate those disagreements, how to mediate conflict in a way that people still get taken care of, even if every single one of their interests isn't accommodated. Democracy is also a social contract. As I said before, it's a voluntary agreement amongst individuals in which organized society is brought into being with things like the right to secure protection or to regulate relations between its members. So even if you don't think you're actively part of this social contract, you are. By not opposing it, you are. And we've already talked about how it relies on the consent of the people. And lastly, I would just add that democracy requires people, it requires its citizens to keep it in check. When people come together to withdraw their support for an unjust system, that is civil resistance. And the individual resistor is sometimes called an activist, sometimes called a dissident, depending on the context and who's using the terms. But as long as he or she are using nonviolent methods, they are engaging in a form of democratic citizenship. Since we're on the theme of democracy, and I started with the premise that American democracy is at risk, I want to play you this 1.5-minute clip from an interview that Supreme Court Justice David Souter did back in 2012, where he talked about what he saw as the coming dangers to American democracy. And you might see some relevance for today. It's actually a pretty chilling message. Can you help me with that, Scott? You can just click on it. Yeah, it should. If you click on it in the slideshow, it should come up. Like, go. Sorry. It's okay.
What I worry about is that when problems are not addressed, people will not know who is responsible. And when the problems get bad enough, as they might do, for example, with another serious terrorist attack, as they might do with another financial meltdown, some one person will come forward and say, "Give me total power and I will solve this problem." That is how the Roman Republic fell. Augustus became emperor not because he arrested the Roman Senate. He became emperor because he promised that he would solve problems that were not being solved. If we know who is responsible, I have enough faith in the American people to demand performance from those responsible. If we don't know, we will stay away from the polls. We will not demand it. And the day will come when somebody will come forward and we and the government will, in effect, say, take the ball and run with it. Do what you have to do. That is the way democracy dies.
Hi, I'm Debbie Skiri, and I'm from Wyndham. And my question tonight is really around where we started this conversation, which was really around the schools.
Okay. You can see why that's kind of chilling today, right? 4 years, 5 years later. All of a sudden, this seems really loud again. Okay, thank you. All right. The other major type of political system that I'm going to mention, because this is what democracy can potentially degrade into if the people don't maintain it, is authoritarianism. I've got a definition of authoritarianism up here. Let me tell you some of the features of authoritarianism, some of the common features. Authoritarian systems tend to value order and security over personal freedom. They promote fear of both an internal and external enemy or perceived enemy. They make attempts to quash or completely eliminate the freedom of speech and the freedom of press. There's limited or no freedom of assembly. There's limited freedom of movement. It's more difficult for people to come into and out of the country. There's not an independent judicial system. The judiciary serves the interests of a political group or person. Any opposition to the regime is harshly punished, and dissent, which I just talked about as a form of citizenship, of democratic citizenship, dissent is treated as treason. There's no rule of law. Okay? There's a lot of talk about law, but there's a difference between legal language and rule of law. Rule of law is where the laws and the Constitution and the system transcend the interests of any political actors. It means under a rule of law, everybody is held to the same standard. Everybody has to obey the law. Everybody is equal in the eyes of the law. And authoritarian systems tend to be xenophobic. Does anybody know that term? See some of you nodding. What does it mean? Yeah, it's fear of foreigners, people who are not us. They also tend to be very masculinist or misogynistic. They consider men to be more valuable than women. And those are just some of the features. There's a lot more. So how is this thing called civil resistance adapted to different types of systems, like authoritarianism? Is it possible to do the things that I just talked about under authoritarianism as well as democracy? Well, weirdly, although resistance under authoritarian conditions is riskier, in some ways it's easier to organize than in open democratic societies. Citizens of democratic or quasi-democratic states are usually, I'm going to use the word sedated, distracted, or co-opted so that they don't have incentives to resist. We're often too busy shopping or watching TV or playing around on social media or just telling ourselves that everything's fine and that somebody else will take care of the problems out there. I mean, if the problems don't affect us directly, who cares, right? It often is only when life gets so hard or people feel so threatened that they perceive that they have nothing left to lose that they'll then engage in civil resistance. And that's unfortunate because you could stave off a lot of problems if you didn't wait till that point. It's a myth that the effectiveness of civil resistance, by the way, is a function of the repressiveness of the system and their willingness to use force against the people. People have had success in addressing injustices in some of the most violent, closed, and repressive societies in the world. In fact, a friend of mine, his name's Ivan Marovic, of a Serbian group called Otpor, which brought down Milosevic in 2000, has said that resistance works like Newton's third law in those kinds of cases. As repression goes up, the resistance goes up with it. But there are some tactics that make more sense in that context because they're relatively low risk but high visibility, so the individual activist is usually more willing to participate. And because authoritarianism relies on fear and the belief that only they are the arbiters of truth, one tactic is to make the leader look ridiculous, to embarrass them publicly, assuming that they are embarrassable, that they have enough shame to be embarrassed. In Iran in 2009, during the resistance against the stolen presidential election, people began sending text messages to each other, making jokes about Ahmadinejad wearing dirty underwear, which was a big deal in that context. This went on for weeks, with millions of people sending and receiving the messages. Now, it's a relatively minor action in the scheme of things, but it removes the sense of reverence around the leader, and over time, if tactics are employed continuously, it can undermine the leader's moral authority. Relatedly, humor is also a common strategy used in highly repressive contexts, because humor is the one thing that is guaranteed to lower fear. When people are laughing, they're not afraid. So the most important goal in an authoritarian setting, in which the ruler controls all or most of the information, is to reveal what might be called the big lie, the foundational myth upon which the regime or the leader bases his rule. Someone must pull back the curtain and reveal that the emperor has no clothes. This is why simply speaking the truth is a revolutionary act in this kind of context. The general approach, though, is the same whether you're operating in a democratic, authoritarian, or other context. It boils down to figuring out what the person or system that's doing the oppressing needs and denying it to them. And this is true whether we're talking about moral authority, political legitimacy, economic resources, or something else. Another tactic to mention that works in all settings but is especially effective under authoritarianism is something called the dilemma action. Dilemma actions, by definition, put the opponent into a lose-lose situation. They're designed in such a way that whatever the opponents do, you will benefit, or whatever they do, they lose. So a couple of examples of dilemma actions from around the world. Several years back, some brave North Koreans put anti-Kim Jong-un messages on helium balloons with photos of his face and then tied them around the capital city. However, North Korea law says that they are required to destroy any subversive material immediately, including any non-sanctioned pictures of, including any non-sanctioned photographs of the leader. But there's another law simultaneously in North Korea that says that any defacing of photos of the dear leader is prohibited. So security forces had to choose between which of the two laws they wanted to break. Either way, they were potentially in trouble, or they were at least making their own system look ridiculous. Another example from about 10 years ago in Sweden was when the government officially declared homosexuality as an illness. People all across the country started calling out from work as gay. So many people did that the declaration was overturned immediately. They quickly realized they couldn't continue to operate in which so many people were ill. And a third example comes from Iran, which is where this photograph is from, where women are forbidden under Islamic law from attending public events, including soccer matches. But soccer is very popular in that country. So during a 2006 World Cup qualifying match at Tehran University, a large group of women staged a sit-in at the stadium. Some of them managed to break through the stadium barricades and got into the bleachers, where they sat down and were captured on camera by the BBC and other international media who were filming the event. This put the government in the position of having to choose between forcibly removing the women, which would diminish the regime's political legitimacy in the eyes of the international audience by making them look brutal, or allowing them to stay, which would diminish their moral authority in the eyes of their more devout citizens. Ultimately, Ahmadinejad had the women removed, but also subsequently had the policy changed. And even though his public justification for changing the law was sexist, he argued that the presence of women at the stadiums would keep the matches cleaner and more civil. It was also a clear-cut victory for the women's movement. So then, to return to our still democratic context, let's talk a little bit more about what it means to be a good citizen. So these answers that I've put up here are answers that I've harvested over the years from students in talks like this or in classrooms. These are the things that come up the most often. Most of us identify civic identity or civic behavior with the act of voting. But in fact, voting is the most minimal way that a citizen can contribute to democracy. This is not to say that you shouldn't vote. You absolutely should. And if you are opposed to all the parties in power and you want to engage in a protest vote, just write in none of the above or your own name. But the act of actually not participating at all reinforces the very system that you think you're protesting when you don't vote. But voting is not enough. You have to be willing to stand up and to resist or dissent when your government is doing things in your name that you do not approve of. We all know the First Amendment rights. There's freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and, anybody? It's the fifth one. Say that louder. I'll just stand here till somebody Googles it. Yes, thank you. Say that again? Petition, yes. This happens all the time. It's odd to me that petition is the one we always forget. Think about that. Why is that? It really shouldn't be surprising because it's the one we spend the least time discussing and the least effort exercising. But in my view, it's arguably the most important of the 5 liberties embodied in the First Amendment, because without it, none of the others have any real meaning. Now, it's cliche, I know, to have Martin Luther King Jr. as a personal hero, but there's a good reason that he's regarded so highly by almost everyone. Though sadly many of us don't know his contributions beyond surface level knowledge or quotes that go around social media in February, or maybe a few quotes from the I Have a Dream speech, King's contributions to American democracy go much deeper. King argued, as did Socrates in his context, as Gandhi did in his, as Henry David Thoreau, Desmond Tutu in South Africa, Tolstoy, Hannah Arendt, Susan B. Anthony, and many others, that people have civic obligations that go beyond voting every couple of years. They argued that it is sometimes the responsibility of people to resist, or if we want to call it, petition, or dissent, or withdraw their consent, or refuse to cooperate with some laws, and in extreme cases, government entirely, and that in doing so, we're protecting democracy and the rights and the freedoms laid out for us in the Declaration of Independence, and that evolved and grew later through the civil rights era and beyond. All of these people knew that rights disappear when they're not exercised. Which brings us to a letter from a Birmingham jail, which, as I mentioned earlier, in my view, is the single best treatise on democratic citizenship ever written. So let's look quickly at some of the key takeaways from King's argument in the letter. It's amazing that more than 50 years later, they're still so relevant. Incidentally, those of you who don't know the story behind the letter from Birmingham jail, what happened was that King was sitting in Birmingham in 1963, and he was awaiting trial. He was arrested. Actually, it's not really even clear why he was arrested. It looks like after the fact that he didn't even break any laws. But the security forces in Birmingham wanted him off the streets because they saw him as a troublemaker. And so he took the time while he was sitting in jail to write a response to a group of white Southern ministers who had earlier very publicly criticized King as being responsible for the violence that was being used against the activists in the civil rights movement. Told him, you just have to tell your people to stop protesting. It's your fault that people are getting killed and hurt. And so King's letter from a Birmingham jail is his response to that critique by those 8 ministers. One of the most important arguments that he makes, and he makes it early on, is this idea that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. What is he saying there? Like, why should we care about what happens elsewhere? Okay. I'm going to leave that as a rhetorical question because I'm limited for time, but I want you to think about that. King is arguing that there's no meaning to these lofty principles that we claim to adhere to if we don't care about what happens to each other. And he actually argues that if you're harmed, then by extension, I'm harmed. He also argues this relationship between means and ends, that what you get at the end of the day is very much a reflection of how you went about getting it. And so he says, I've preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. And I've tried to make clear that it's wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But I now must affirm that it's just as wrong to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. So either way, the latter argument, using moral means to get immoral ends, was a little more provocative. He's talking specifically about the police in Birmingham and other cities who, on the surface, treated protesters civilly, didn't openly beat them in public, but were very willing to continue to uphold this racist system of segregation. So he's making a case there that ends and means are totally inseparable. He also says that we have to be very careful because law and morality don't always coincide. And he says that there are, in fact, two types of laws, just laws and unjust laws. And he says, I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not just a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. But conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And then he goes on to define what he sees as the difference between just and unjust laws. He says a just law is a man-made code that squares with moral law or the law of God. Remember, he's writing this letter to a group of Christian ministers, so he's appealing to them using their own language. Okay? He's telling them, not only are you not great citizens, democratic citizens, or you're not advocating democratic citizenship, but you're maybe not the greatest Christians either. And then he says, an unjust law is a human law that's not rooted in eternal or natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And then he goes on to talk about what happened in Hitler's Germany and how what was legal and what was moral were actually completely at odds. Next, he makes the argument that when law and morality come into conflict, it's our duty as democratic citizens to resist. And beyond that, he says, we're not going to get these freedoms, we're not going to get these liberties just because we ask for them nicely. He says freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, it must be demanded by the oppressed. And this is the heart of citizenship, to be willing to stand up and take action when law or policy is inherently unjust and out of harmony with moral law. The question you should ask yourself is, how do you know this when you see it? How can you tell the difference between what is moral and just and what is immoral and unjust? And I would argue that most of us have this internal compass that if we really pay attention to, if we don't suppress, that will help us with that. And it's almost never wrong. And then lastly, he makes the case that if we're not actively resisting injustice, we're upholding it. And he makes what might have been, I don't know, painful for some of you to read, a very pointed case about what he calls the white moderate. The white moderate is the white person who's not the member of the KKK, but says, at least with lip service, that we agree with your goals in principle, but you got to slow down. And he says that person actually may be more dangerous than the extremist. He says shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And I would ask that as democratic citizens, as students, you think about what he means here in terms of how you live your life today, in terms of campaigns like Black Lives Matter or the current wave of Islamophobia. Are you unwillingly or unknowingly upholding systems of injustice? Over the years, I've tried to condense this talk into what I call the citizenship as the 4 C's, these different components of your identity: civic virtue, civic engagement, civic literacy, and civil resistance. I've talked about all of these to some degree. By the way, I'm making this PowerPoint available, so anybody who wants to investigate these more carefully on your own time, you will be able to do so. And then, to end, I'm going to give you a couple of quotes and perspectives from some different folks. This is a friend of mine, Keith Olbermann. Do you guys know him? Okay. It's weird to me to think that you guys are so young that you don't know who Keith Olbermann is. But he had his own show on MSNBC for a long time. He's more recently a sports broadcaster, but he was a political commentator. And I asked him to send me,
Not done yet, folks.
almost done, what he thought of this idea of civil resistance, to give me a quote for you. And this is what he sent me. At its essence, dissent is the purest civic virtue because it does not need to be more complicated than publicly asserting that something is wrong and must be fixed. That's the idea of stating the truth out loud. It doesn't even have to contain a solution or a balanced analysis because the simple truth is every time anything that has ever improved in the history of the world, it started simply with someone publicly asserting that something was wrong and must be fixed. This is an argument against complacency, necessary for democratic citizenship. Václav Havel, the first president of Democratic Czech Republic, also got it. And Reverend Desmond Tutu, who was the moral voice of the movement in South Africa, also got it. I wanted to show you a clip by him, but I know that I'm out of time, so you can watch it on your own time. It's 1 minute long. You can watch it on your own time in the, what's that? You want me to play it?
1 minute, yeah.
Okay. Well, and I'll tell you what, we'll end on that. So before you, 1 second, because what we'll do is once it's over, they can go. I'm going to be at the round table today. I threw a lot of ideas at you. If anybody wants to come to the round table and flesh these out a little further or challenge me, please do so. What you're going to see here is the analysis of what happened in South Africa at the end of the movement to end apartheid, and you'll see Desmond Tutu's comment on why it happened. Okay?
Before you, Father, appealing, asking for peace in the rest of the country.
They have never in their lives voted, nor have their parents or their grandparents before them.
Our Father, we are asking for peace in our world. Reveal yourself, reveal yourself. Reveal yourself, reveal yourself. Reveal yourself, reveal from heaven.
The struggle against apartheid, against the racism in South Africa, fundamentally had been non-violent. We were inspired by what had happened in India, in Poland, in the civil rights movement in the United States, what was happening in the Philippines. I suppose that human beings looking at it would say that arms are the most dangerous things that a dictator, a tyrant needs to fear. But in fact, no. It is when people decide they want to be free. Once they have made up their minds to that, there's nothing that will stop them.
All right.